Today's going to be the final the final class. Here's Alex. How you doing, Alex? Of the discussion that we began, and we started off with a question, and that question is: we established certain facts in the previous series with regards to God. So, okay, now we know that God exists, and we're faced with the question. What's that question we're going to face? Why would God change anything and make a world, make a universe? Right? Assuming that there was intelligence, there was design behind the universe, there had to be purpose as well. Because an intelligence, and certainly an intelligence, the kind of intelligence that would take to create something so sophisticated as our universe, and somewhere between 1.25 and 8.7 million species that each propagate, and a wonderful creation, unlike a whole system and the planets and everything. Liquid water and the complex and the simple, and billions of humans. There's got to be some reason for it, and that's a very difficult question, because believing in God presupposes that, or at least the Jewish definition of God presupposes that God cannot have any limitations. So it can't be that God needs something that needs to be kind of be fulfilled with the universe. But if he doesn't need anything, well then, so what lack was there that compelled him to create the universe? It's that was the dichotomy, that was the contradiction that we started off with in this discussion. And we said that there's two Jewish answers to this question. Why did God create the universe? Number one is that God, because God existed just as an independent entity, was just God, he didn't have anyone to give to, and therefore he had to create a universe and create humans to be receptacles of God's giving. So God wanted to give, he was unable to because it was just God. So he had to create a universe, and in the universe create people, and the people could be the receptacles of God's giving. Hence, that this answer would claim that God created the universe for humans, but more specifically, so humans could receive pleasure. That's one answer, and you find that everywhere in Jewish philosophy. The other answer we said is that God, because God was a king without a kingdom. He was like the king of the mountain, but there's no one else. He had no dominion over any subject. There was no constituents. Therefore, his kingdom, so to speak, was lacking, and that would be rectified by creating a world, creating humans who could independently testify to God's existence via usage of their free will, and therefore that would fix or fill some lack that was existing due to the fact that God was just there by himself. Those are the two answers. And I made the claim that at the end, they're really saying the same thing. And it's just two different vantage points of the same answer. So today is a time where I want to actually address that thing. And we talked about the different kinds of pleasures that the world offers us. We have the simple pleasures, the physical pleasures, the material pleasures. Pleasures can be experienced with the senses. Pleasures that are not so hard to attain, like the chocolate bar, or anything physical, anything that could be experienced with the five senses. It's a very simple pleasure. There's not much of a learning curve. You don't really need to give up so much to get it. And you know what? It doesn't really last. It goes away once the cause of the pleasure goes away. The pleasure goes with it. Simple, basic pleasures. We realize there's more sophisticated pleasures. There's happiness, which is more of a temperament. It's kind of an emotional pleasure. It's somewhat harder to define. It's harder to attain as well. How many books are there written about how to achieve happiness? Lots and lots of them. So there's obviously a form. I never seen a book, How to Properly Enjoy an Ice Cream. I don't saw a book with a big picture. Okay, what is the method, Because it's very easy to do. It's very easy, and no one has any problems enjoying ice creams. So some people eat it with two hands, some with one hand, but there isn't really some sort of insight or process or education necessary to enjoy that. And that's the mark of all the simple pleasures. It's simple. You don't really need to learn how to enjoy it. You get more sophisticated, talk about happiness, it's more complex, harder to achieve, you have to give up a little bit more, but the payout is greater. Happiness, we talked about love. Love is even more of a dedication, even more of compromising on your identity, even more of giving up of yourself. How painful is it? How difficult is it to actually acclimate with someone else and share your life with someone else? It's very difficult. You're giving up on your independence. You're giving up on your identity. You're giving up on your space. You're giving up on your time, your energy, your emotional capacity. Right? It's a lot of giving up, right? But the payout is greater. So we see that with the ascension from the simple to the more complex pleasures, we notice a few things. Number one, the payout is greater, the pleasure is greater, it's more sophisticated, it's more sublime, it lasts for longer. But additionally, what you need to do to achieve that is more difficult. Today we're talking about the ultimate pleasure. The ultimate pleasure. And when we see ultimate pleasure, we know that it's also going to be the hardest to achieve. The most difficult, you're going to have to give up the most. But it's the ultimate pleasure as well. So I wanted to look, and I also find that this is, every time I talk about this, it's kind of hard. It's hard to talk about and explain because it's one of those things that you don't really understand it until you experience it. So, and we'll notice that I mentioned this a few times that the Rambam, Maimonides, when he talks about spirituality and spiritual pleasure, he equates it to describing color to a blind person. And I actually put it as one of my quotes here. Try describing color to a blind person. What words would you use? How would you describe it? There's no way to do it. It's kind of an experience. If you haven't experienced it, you cannot describe it. And because this pleasure is a purely spiritual pleasure, there's almost no words that I could use to try to convey the idea. I could talk about the idea. I could try to do but there's no way that I could, using physical words, describe to you, or even the books to describe to us what it is. So in our minds, we don't perceive this as even a pleasure. Like, spiritual pleasure, what does that even mean? Like, what does it even mean to have spiritual pleasure? What does that even, like, those words seem foreign to us. Why? Because we're physical beings, so we see the world from a physical perspective, and it's very hard for us to imagine something that we've never experienced. So that's the difficulty that we face. Getting definitions. But what I'm going to do is, that's why I decided to actually take the sources, some of the sources that talk about this, and read how they describe it, and analyze it, and maybe use that as a springboard for us to maybe attempt to dip our toe into the waters of spiritual pleasures. Okay? So let's start from the first source. And I translated this myself. It's not a perfect translation. It's in English. The book is written in Hebrew. This is a book written by Luzzatto. Luzzatto is at the forefront of Jewish philosophers, and he's actually almost a contemporary. He lived in the 18th century, 1707 to 1746. He only lived 39 years, but he wrote like 150 books. This was just an incredible, incredible person. And this book, The Path of the Just, is the fundamental work of Musar. If you hear the term Musar and the whole area of Jewish life that governs character refinement and ethical perfection, this book is viewed as the book with regards to Musar. And at the beginning, he asks the question, he says, okay, what's the point? What are we here for? And this is part of what he says. And what the sages have instructed us is that man was created for the purpose of having the pleasure of God and enjoying the zenith of his Shekhinah. Zenith is the word that I use to translate Ziv. I don't know how else you would translate it. So man was created for the purpose. What kind of purpose? To have the pleasure of God. Pleasure of God. What does it mean, the pleasure of God? It's a spiritual pleasure. It's the next level, the highest level of pleasure that we could possibly attain. For this is the true pleasure and the greatest delight that could be possibly found, or could possibly be found. Okay, so he says, number one, this is the pleasure of God, the zenith of the Shekhinah. It's a true pleasure. He's obviously insinuating there's some pleasures which are less true, whatever that means. And it's the greatest pleasure, greatest delight that can be found. And he uses different words to describe pleasure and delight, which is also something which is of note. He's clearly talking about two aspects of this thing. He calls it a pleasure and calls it a delight. He calls it a ta'anug in Hebrew and an idun. These are different words, and this will come back. This will be a critical point later on. And the venue for this delight is in truth the next world that was created for this purpose. Okay, so where do we have this pleasure? Next world. Okay, next world was created for this purpose. But the path to reach this desired destination is this world. And the means to bring a man to this goal is the mitzvot that the Almighty commanded us to do. Okay, so what he's saying is like this, a few things. Number one, the purpose, the ultimate purpose is this pleasure of God. It's a spiritual pleasure, right? Basking, so to speak, in the Shekhinah, whatever that even means. We'll try to understand what that means. And this is a true pleasure. It's a greatest delight. He uses different words to determine, to describe what is this thing. Is that a pleasure, is a delight? Well, it's a true pleasure and it's the greatest delight. And he says the venue for this delight is the next world. What about the venue for this pleasure? Let's critically analyze what he's saying. He's saying a few things. We're here to have the pleasure of God. This pleasure of God is a true pleasure and a great delight. He uses two words to describe this pleasure. It's a delight and it's a pleasure. And then he says the venue for this delight is the next world. So wait a minute. If the venue for this delight is in the next world, where is the venue for this pleasure? He uses two terms. He says this is a pleasure and it's a delight. The delight is the next world. Where's the pleasure?
In this world.
Boom! Booyah! Correct. He's clearly telling us that while this spiritual pleasure is something which we'll have a much greater time understanding in the next world. What the next world means is a spiritual world. And I have a few quotes later on from Maimonides to underscore what this actually means. A spiritual world devoid of physicality, of physical barriers, it's much easier to perceive spirituality. Right? It's hard for you to see spirituality because your eyes are physical and your eyes see physicality. So if there was an angel in this room, well, angel's a spiritual being. You don't see it because you don't have the tools. You don't have the vision, the spiritual vision. I know that's creepy to think about the angel in the room. But that's an idea. The idea is you have physical tools. Your physical tools enable you to connect to the physical world, not the spiritual world. You do have something deep within you, which is a spiritual spark, a spiritual neshama, a spirit, whatever you want to call it. You have some sort of spiritual entity within yourself as well. True. But for you to perceive spirituality, for you to understand spirituality, for you to experience it, it's much easier in a world where you're just spiritual. That's the world that we call the next world. When that is, I don't know. Maybe we'll talk about that in the class, the upcoming class of what happens after you die. It's not this world, it's next world. I don't know when that is. It's a good question. That being said, in this world, there is still a capacity to perceive this pleasure because, like he says, the place for the delight is in next world, but the place for pleasure is in this world. Okay. But either way, we see from this, and this is one of the sources, one of the primary sources. There are other sources which are much, much earlier, the sources that go back 2,000 years. This is only a 300-year-old document, roughly, maybe a little less than 300 years old. But this document outlines it in a very clear fashion. The purpose is for pleasure. What kind of pleasure? The greatest levels of pleasure. We saw a progression. There's different kinds of pleasures. We experienced. We dabbled a little bit in what the Torah tells us about how to achieve, the physical pleasures, the happiness, the love, the meaning, purpose. As we grow and we see there's different kinds of pleasures, we broaden our horizons and our perspective of what pleasure is through the Torah. Now we're reaching the end, and the end is this highest level of pleasure, and we still could experience it in this world. In next world, it's much easier, right? Devoid of physical obstacles. In this world, we could still do it. We're going to try to see how we can do that, and let's look at the next three paragraphs. And this comes from the Maimonides. Right? Maimonides is the 12th century, the greatest figure in Jewish halacha and Jewish philosophy. The greatest codifier of Jewish law. he has an essay. He has an essay in which he talks about reward and punishment. And he starts off with an assumption. He says, if you do good, right, the basic idea is that reward is given, commensurate to your good activities. And similarly, there's this idea called punishment. He asks, well, what does it mean? And he goes into this wonderful treatise on reward and punishment, also deals with motivation and altruism and spirituality. It's a fascinating piece. And I selected 3 different paragraphs because I think it's germane to our subject. And let's start it right now. I'm doing this a little quicker than usual because I want to finish in time. Okay, now I can begin to discuss the matter with which I am really concerned. So he starts off with this very, very, very long introduction where he kind of like negates a lot of mistaken misconceptions. And then he says, and after he's halfway through, he's like, now we could start. Okay, no, that just as a blind man cannot image color, right? Blind person can't be described color. This is what I talked about. And a deaf person cannot experience sounds. And as I don't know how you even read that word. Eunuch cannot feel sexual desire. So bodies cannot attain spiritual delights. Right? We have limitations. We have limitations just like a blind person has limitations in how could they perceive color. So too we have limitations in our physical bodies have limitations in how we could experience spiritual delights. Like fish who do not know what the element of fire, so are the delights of the spiritual world unknown in this material world. Spiritual delight does not come within our experience at all. We enjoy only bodily pleasures, which come to us through our physical senses, which, such as the pleasure of eating, drinking, and sensual intercourse. Other levels of delight are not present in our experience. We neither recognize nor grasp them at first thought. They come to us only after great searching. It can hardly be otherwise, since we live in a material world and are, therefore, able to achieve only inferior and discontinuous delights. Spiritual delights are eternal. They last forever. They never break off. Between these two kinds of delights, there is no similarity of any sort. Now, whenever this is why it's so much. It's very hard to use sources because it's like you just read and everyone's just like, oh, okay. But let's try to highlight what he says. He says here that we are limited due to our physical makeup. We are limited in our capacity to understand the spiritual, just like the blind person and the deaf person and the eunuch. We have limitations, and our experiences are primarily in the physical world. Still, at the end, he throws in this caveat by saying it could come to us after great searching. Other levels of delight are not present to our experience. We neither recognize nor grasp them at first thought. So, at first thought, if you just have a simplistic way of trying to conceptualize this kind of pleasure, you'll have a hard time. However, they come to us only after great searching. So, after great searching, it is possible to understand it. Okay, so that's the first paragraph. Let's go to the second paragraph. I skipped a few different paragraphs to get to this, but I wanted to highlight just some things that he says. He talks about the men who have dedicated their lives to spiritual goals. These men who choose to purify themselves will reach this spiritual height. They will neither experience bodily pleasures nor will they want them. So he says, interesting, he says, when you reach the point of having spiritual pleasures, the physical pleasures lose their appeal. It's not exciting anymore. Why is that? This will resemble a powerful king. You have someone who's a powerful king, he would hardly want to go back to playing ball with the children as he did before he became king. I know my kids love playing with Lego. It's a wonderful pleasure. But if you're a teen, you have much bigger pleasures to tackle. Like, you're not going to go back to playing Lego. Right? Lego's fun, but if, for your pleasure spectrum that you're used to partaking in, that, if that still fits into what's exciting for you, then wonderful. But if you have moved on to bigger and better things, it loses its appeal, its allure. The physical pleasures are not as exciting anymore. Such games attracted him when he was a child and was unable to understand the real difference between playing ball and royal power. Like children, we now praise the Lord for the delights of the body and didn't understand the delights of the soul. He says, in a certain measure, we're children as well. Why? Because we have to develop our spiritual senses, our spiritual antenna, and once we do that, we'll say, yeah, ice cream's good. It's wonderful. Is that really all there is? is that really what we're here for? Is that really worth the time and effort? Maybe it does have some place, but it's certainly not as exciting as it was once you partake in greater pleasures. And let's read the final one, the final paragraph. Our sages also wrote, "In the world to come, there is no eating, drinking, washing, anointing, or sexual intercourse, but the righteous sit with the crowns on their head and enjoying the radiance of the divine presence." So he brings a quote from the Talmud that describes what the world to come is going to look like. And he describes it as a world that does not have any physical characteristics. There's no eating, drinking, washing, anointing, sexual intercourse. So what is there? The righteous sit with their crowns on their head, enjoying the radiance of the divine presence. So it's a different kind of existence. In this passage, the expression "with their crowns on their head" signifies the immortality of the soul, being in firm possession of the idea which is God the Creator. Okay, so this is an important sentence. This idea of the world to come, this idea is one of eternity. It doesn't have the physical limitations, right? In time or space or anything. Our world is based on time. You're born and you die, right? You have physical limitations. You connect to the world in a physical way. The next world is a world of spirituality. It's a spiritual world, and therefore there are no limitations. But what's that last sentence there? The soul being in firm possession of the idea which is God the Creator. The pleasure that he's talking about is the pleasure of God. Experiencing God, understanding God to the best of your ability. That is a spiritual pleasure. That's what we talk about. When we talk about spiritual pleasures, the highest levels of pleasure, it is understanding, experiencing God. God is a purely spiritual idea. Hence, if we're entrenched in physicality, we don't even see why that has value. Just like a small child who wants to play with a ball doesn't perceive the pleasure of being a king. He'd rather play ball. You dangle some candy and that's all he wants. As physical entities who only engage in physical pursuits, we don't see the pleasure of understanding God, of perceiving God as being of any value. Because it's our souls, and our souls are dulled, and our souls are within ourselves, and our souls are not the tools that we use to connect to the world. However, once you taste it, once you experience it, once you've been there, once you've done this before, everything else moves down a notch. Everything else is less exciting, less appealing, less motivating, something that you're less interested in. Okay, so that's the idea. We're talking about this highest level of pleasure. It's kind of hard to define. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to experience. It's obviously more work to attain. What is it? It's the pleasure of God. It's the pleasure of basking in the God's delight, the delight of God. It's in the zenith of the Shekhinah. It's these different terms of understanding God. Yes?
I was thinking just about myself and my experiences, but sometimes I can, start by worshiping God, by thanking Him, and when I just get totally lost
Immersed in it?
Yes, where I think of nothing but Him, there's complete peace there. Now, I can't stay there. You know what I mean? It's just momentarily. But is that what you're talking about? In a sense.
I do believe that yes, that would be one way to do it. Let's go to the bottom, the last little paragraph. This is from Maimonides, wrote a book of mitzvos, book of mitzvot. Sefer HaMitzvot is called in Hebrew. And he takes all the 613 mitzvot and he explains what it means. And the mitzvah number 3, so it's all the way at the top of the mitzvahs, it's a mitzvah to love God. We say in the Shema, ve'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, you have to love God. What does it mean to love God? We can't even understand God. What does that mean? So the Rambam explains, this means to think and introspect in his mitzvahs, as I should say, in his Torah and his creation, till we gain insight, and we take pleasure with this insight to the utmost degree. This is the requisite love. This is a very, very short little piece. I'll read it again. What does it mean to love God? Number one, you have to think. You have to engage in some sort of intellectual process. You have to do introspection. What is introspection? What's the difference between thinking and introspection? Introspection is a much deeper level of thought. It's like isolation, right? When you isolate everything else and you just zero in on a certain thing, right? You think about it, then it's a much deeper level of thought. Okay, what are you thinking about? His mitzvahs, any one of the mitzvahs of God, the Torah of God, and the creation of God. What do we mean by creation of God? It means science, the world around us. So you think of deep thoughts until you have an insight, until you discover something, until you see the double helix form, or until you see the expanding universe, right? You spend years dedicated on this subject. Right? You're trying to find this God particle that they're trying to find, right? You know it's there. There's such incredible complexity. The way God mapped out the world. Right? You see a cell. You understand the function of the liver. You see how everything fits in. Right? You have this insight, this moment, this aha moment, as we call it, and then you have pleasure. This certain pleasure sets in after that because you basically perceived a certain measure of God, and that pleasure is what it means to love God. Basically, 4 steps. You got to take God's creation, either His Torah, His mitzvahs, or even the physical creation, science. God gave us this in order that we can use them as a tool to understand Him. You understand Torah, you understand a certain measure of God. You understand a mitzvah. Mitzvah is a God's commandment. He says, do this. He does it for a specific reason, right? Because contained within every mitzvah is a certain measure of understanding of God. Now, it's not superficially understood. You got to think. You got to zero in. You have to have deep, steady, concentrated thought on that particular thing, whether it's creation, science, whether it's Torah, whether it's any one of the mitzvahs. You got to do that until you have some sort of insight. You discover something. Right? It's a hasagah, it's an attainment, some sort of achievement, some sort of intellectual achievement, aha moment, and that pleasure is the pleasure of understanding God. And this is what's required upon us with regards to the mitzvah of loving God. Now, if you notice, he says, and we take pleasure in this insight with the utmost degree, which is, I translate this myself, but maybe a better way to say it is the ultimate. You experience the ultimate pleasure. This is the way to do it. God, so to speak, we mentioned this countless times. The idea of God is so distant from us. We have so many limitations. We are physical entities who experience the world in a physical way. God is invisible. We cannot see Him. There's nothing you can do to see Him. Still, God put us here and wants us to connect to Him. Wants us to quote-unquote see Him, understand Him, relate to Him. And what He did is He made the world in a way where there are certain ideas, right? Intellectual ideas, physical ideas that are like I like to describe it as a what's it called when you have like like when you put out the Easter eggs, a hunt. What's it called when you like a scavenger hunt? Yeah, it's like a scavenger hunt of Easter eggs. But that's what it's. Yeah, sorry, I apologize for that. It's a scavenger hunt, right? God hid into the world little pockets of tremendous complexity.
Could have used the analogy looking for the afikoman.
Oh, look at that coming. Okay, maybe. Of incredible complexity, right? And I think years ago, and 300 years ago, they didn't know what a cell was. They didn't know. Right? It's a tremendous discovery. They discovered it. It was always there. People 2,000 years ago had cells, right? But it was a discovery. Why does God need to make such a complex world? Because it's a scavenger hunt. It's a little pocket of complexity that makes humans realize how infinitesimally complex is God's creation. And hence, how wonderful the idea, it's like an insight that we have into God. And that experience is a spiritual experience that could grant the person the highest degree of pleasure possible. That's why we have a Torah. A Torah is God's wisdom. The Torah is infinitely complex, right? I personally myself have experienced this. That one page of Torah you could study it and goes deeper and deeper, and no matter how deep you go, you see it's even deeper than that. And because it's the wisdom of God. The wisdom of God, just like God Himself has no limitations, His Torah also has limitations. Like it says in the book of Job, it's Ruchava Miniyam. It's wider than the ocean, right? Arucham Eretz Mida. It's broader than the entire universe. Right? That's what the Torah is. The universe is like that as well. It's no matter how much of understanding we think we have in the brain and how the brain functions, right? It's still a sliver of the top of the of the iceberg. It's nothing. We know how little we know about it. It's so complex. Right? Why does God make it so complex? Because it is a way for us to perceive His greatness, to have a little measure of understanding of experiencing God. That pleasure, the ultimate pleasure. That pleasure is the pleasure that we're describing here. And that pleasure is a pleasure that's generally reserved for a time when our way of connecting to the world is spiritual and spiritual only. Our physical inhibitions prevent us or make it much more difficult for us to perceive spirituality. It's very difficult. We could still do it. Right? We have an outline of how it works. Right? We have the instructions of the Rambam and the Maimonides at the bottom. Right? It was basically 4 steps. You got to take something. It could be anything that God did for us. It could be Torah. It could be a mitzvah like you described. It could be science. It could be an atom. It could be an animal. You could take an animal and see it's such a tiny little, these tiny little flies, and they contain complexity that is unrivaled by anything that humans do. The smallest, the most simple of flies is something which no amount of human engineering could create. And to top that off, those things could propagate and reproduce. Like nothing that humans could do could reproduce on their own. Nothing. It's not possible. Everything that even computers, right? Computers they're only as good as how they're programmed. It's how well they're programmed. They cannot think on their own. Don't worry about the artificial intelligence. It's not happening. It should only be given intelligence, and that intelligence could be used that's how it works. A tiny little fly is more complex than any amount of technology, of engineering that humans could possibly do. Within our bodies, right? If you were to string out all the little canals and veins and arteries and passageways, you would have a network larger than the entire systems of roads in the world, something like that. Just think about the complexity. It's mind-boggling. If you just within ourselves, just take out every vein and connect it, end to end, with every other vein and every other artery and every other passageway within ourselves. Mind-boggling complexity. And there's never traffic. There's never traffic. There's never rubbernecking or any sort of impasse. It's amazing. You have one blood clot, you're done. Oh, you're not done. You're in grave danger of being done. Think about a system, a traffic system, that the entire world, and there's cars everywhere on every single street, and there's never an accident. And there's never a buildup. And there's never a blockage. And there's never any potholes. And it just works without asking questions. Mind-boggling complexity. And it's there for us. And why did the Almighty do it like that? Because we could use that as a stepping stone to understanding Him. You have to think about that. You have to analyze it. You have to think. You have to zero in on such a thing. It's science, but it's God's handiwork. And there's so many examples, even things that you encounter every day, like just liquid water, being able to breathe oxygen, and the photosynthesis, and how it all works out perfectly. That the balance of carbon and just perfect. The Almighty made it for us that we could live. And the exact distance of the sun from that the small little sliver of temperature that human life is possible at, right? And we're exactly right there, right? Perfect, 93 million miles away from the sun. A little bit close, a little bit further, we're either toast or we're icicles. All perfect. It's a way to perceive God's handiwork. If you think about that, you analyze it, you have this aha moment of achievement, of discovery, of insight, and you see God. Right? Obviously, it's not. It's a small little pocket of a small little experience that you have. But in a certain measure, you have this pleasure of seeing this complexity that God put into the universe for us to understand Him. This is the pleasure that we're talking about. This is the highest level pleasure. It's a pleasure that we hope we will be able to experience as well in the next world in a much greater way. In the next world, there's no such a thing as physicality. We're just spirituals. It's much easier for us to understand it once you've experienced it, just like the blind person. If they haven't seen color, they have a hard time understanding it. It's very hard to give descriptions to it. Still, I think, even in this world, even with our current state, we have enough out there. There's enough out there. There's enough complexity out there in science, in the mitzvahs, in Torah, that we could use to understand God.
I'm intrigued by all this, particularly the next world being spiritual more than physical.
Yes.
Is that the only Jewish teaching on that? And what I'm getting at is I've also heard what I think is Jewish thought on this, that the next world could be a physical world where man knows war no more, where the whole world is filled with knowledge of God, and even the sacrificial system might return. That's a physical world, isn't it?
Yes, so absolutely correct. So actually, if we were to take this this treatise of Maimonides, and at the beginning he starts off by saying, "Wait a minute. There seems to be so much confusion with this question. We talk about reward and punishment. We see the idea of a Mashiach. It's all over Jewish literature. The Mashiach is in this world. We see the idea of Gan Eden, Garden of Eden, paradise, all over Jewish literature. Right? We see the idea of Tchias HaMesim, resuscitation of the dead, right? All over Jewish literature, literally everywhere. And we see the idea of Olam Haba also. And what he's trying to do is distinguish what is. They're all true. The question is, what is the ultimate, and what is just, and what is just a nice thing that's going to happen, but it's not the ultimate end.
So it doesn't contradict.
No, absolutely not. So he later on, like literally, like a paragraph after this, he talks about, okay, what does it mean that the world will be filled with knowledge of God? Right? That's the physical world. Right here, right now, in a certain phase of the physical world's existence, it will be a mass understanding. And I think even today, like you talk about God. Okay? There is a certain measure of mass acceptance of this idea. 2,000 years ago, only the Jews claimed that there was one infinite being. Only the Jews. And now you have the majority of the world already adopted either that idea entirely or something very similar to that idea. So yes, the idea of mass adoption, that's true, and that's in this world, and that's not what we're talking about. It's a distinct idea. But you're absolutely correct, yes.
Well, I could be wrong in this, but I was understanding it as the physical world will continue to exist. Like, Messianic era, Allah, physical world will still exist. We will still be physical beings, but our brains and our desires will have changed to the point that we're no longer driven by that physicality, and we're no longer limited by that kind of physical mindset and kind of how we think and how we're motivated and why we do the things that we do and what our wants and our focus is. And that's what the difference would be. Like, we would still be physical people, but we'd be better people.
Yeah, so that might be the Messianic era or resuscitation of the dead. It's not clear. Like, I'm trying to find actual sources that say what happens when, what's the progression. These things are all true, but the next world, quote unquote, we have that source. There's no eating, there's no drinking, there's no washing, no anointing, no sexual intercourse. Right?
That's our sages' road.
Well, that's in the Talmud. That's an ancient Jewish.
Is there any Torah?
Yeah. These things are all sourced in the Torah. There's countless sources for.
There would be no eating, drinking, or washing.
It's not specifically that. That's just to describe it as being devoid of physicality.
Right.
In the next world, for example, we talk about resuscitation of the dead. I was just learning
Well, that's
this.
pretty specific.
That's specific.
The Valley of the Dry Bones, right?
Well, actually, when the Talmud says, "Okay, where is the source in the Torah?" It brings about 15 or 20 sources. It doesn't bring that one, Valley of the Dry Bones. It brings it, but because it brings it to analyze whether that's a metaphor or that's real, and has a debate about that story in Ezekiel. But also that's from the prophets, and when it's trying to bring proofs from the Torah itself. But it brings, I didn't count them, like about 15 or 20 sources for this for the idea of resuscitation of the dead. But these are all distinct themes, and I would advise everyone to read this Maimonides piece in its entirety. I have a translation of it in English if you want. Just email me. Was there any other questions? Yeah.
I was just to comment, isn't it just a process that we have to go through in order to get to the ultimate one?
Yeah, so the Mishnah Pirkei Avot says, Ha'olam hazeh, this world in front of the next world is like a corridor. It's a hallway to the next world. And the next world is like the ballroom, so to speak. It's like a passageway. That's one source. There's many, many other sources that talk about this. But yeah, it is a progression. Like it's, yes.
Would be one process,
Oh,
one stepping stone, and
yes,
then
yes,
we
yes.
get to the-
Yeah, like we still talk about the Jews going back to Israel as being part of it. That's already begun in a big way.
Like the
Past 150 years.
third temple that has to be built.
The temple and the Messiah and all those things are like
The process of
we're well on our way. Like 200 years ago, the idea of Jews living in Israel was so ridiculous. Like, there was almost nothing going on in Israel. There was no one living there at all. Like much less Jews. Like today, there's 6 million Jews living in Israel. It's amazing to see. Like, just if you were to zoom out and just give a historical perspective on what's happening, we see the Jews come back to Israel. This is foretold in the Torah. 200 years ago, someone says, that's outrageous. The Jews going back to Israel? It's insane. Jews haven't lived in Israel for 1,800 years. Jerusalem was the first Judean city, right? There was no one living in Jerusalem. It was empty. It was desolate after the Romans came. Jews were everywhere else in the world, in Europe, in North Africa, out east in Arabia, but Israel. And now, look at that. The Torah foretold the Jews go back to Israel. And look, there's 6 million Jews living there. So that's already, that process has begun. We say that the idea of the world having knowledge of God, that has already begun. Right? There's the majority of the people in the world believe, I wouldn't say exactly the same way we believe with regards to God, but somewhat similar to the idea of God. Mass adoption of that idea. I don't think we're waiting for some sort of like bomb to drop. It's not like, oh, everyone knows it. There's a process and there's a progress, and we're well on our way to have that actually being actualized. Now the next world, we're not there yet. We're still eating and drinking.
And I wanted to ask you this earlier while it was in my head and I forgot. What is the Jewish concept of having a guardian angel?
A guardian
because
angel?
You're talking about things that are well accepted, and certainly having a guardian angel would be something that the average person would have a point of reference on. What's the Jewish thought on that?
Guardian angel. Well, we have some verses in the Torah, in Psalms, for example, that talk about there's an angel to my right, an angel to my left, an angel in front of me, an angel behind me.
Correct.
We have
Many
Shomer
people
Ptaim
believe
Hashem.
we have 2 guardian angels that escort us through this physical life.
We have sources of the Talmud talking about the angels. 60 angels to your right and 60 angels to your left when you're sleeping.
And why would that be a concept that could not be accepted by everyone?
I think it could be. It's just hard for us to, like I said, if there's angels in this room, we don't see them. Right?
But why would you think it not logical for that to be?
I think it might be perfectly logical.
It might be, yes.
It might be. Yeah. The question is, what benefit do we have? Like, what do you gain by saying that there's angels? And that the idea of an angel is obviously that the Torah talks about angels. Genesis is talking. How many angels are there in Genesis? There's lots of angels. Abraham encounters angels. Jacob sends angels. Jacob has the angels in the.
Right, he wrestles with.
He wrestles with an angel. In the sanctuary, we have a picture of Jacob sleeping, and the angels went up and down the ladder. So yes, the idea is ubiquitous in Judaism, and it's also in Jewish literature. Yeah, so.
I sense a hesitancy in you that.
No, I'm trying to think of the guardian angel, someone guarding you. I'm sure there's a source for it.
Well, I think it makes sense to be cautious about something that can be easily manipulated
Yeah.
for negative purposes. Like whenever there's not a universal agreement on it, and there's no.
No, there might be universal agreement. Yeah, it's also one of those things that you can't really prove.
Like it's not provable, and it's an idea that exists in other cultures, and has been used in very negative ways, and it's it's something that could potentially be used to hurt someone. And so, like, I'm always very cautious about ideas like that, like the guardian angel concept, or kind of the popular conception of representing your conscious or the ego in superego ideas as angels on your shoulder. I just feel like those concepts are big, and they come across multiple cultures and multiple belief systems, and it would be really easy to use that idea, if you accept it as truth, to lead somebody astray. And so I personally am just real hinky on that idea.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know.
Yeah,
What she said, huh?
I agree. Like we talked about the Satan, right? Yeah. So Satan is a concept, which is another example. Like the Christian idea of Satan and the Jewish idea of Satan are very different. We have something in Jewish literature, in Jewish philosophy, called Satan or Satan. It doesn't mean the same thing as. So I'm trying to think. Is there any source anywhere that says that we have some sort of guardian angel? We have sources that say Shomer Pnei Hashem, that the Almighty guards us from happenstances or occurrences, or dangerances.
It's not a personal thing. Like I feel like the Christian idea of guardian angel is this very personal idea.
No, but we do have the idea of personal supervision. Like God is supervising us on an individual level.
But He didn't assign. Like it's not like Bob the angel has been assigned to you, and Joe the angel has been assigned to me, and they're like riding on top of our car while we drive. Like I feel like in other belief systems, that's what guardian angel means. And I don't know. I mean, maybe that is a Jewish idea, but I have not seen that as a Jewish idea. But that's definitely an idea that you would pick up from Greek and Roman philosophies. This idea that that God and demigods and that kind of stuff interact in the physical realm in that way.
No, but we don't deny that God interacts in the physical realm.
He does.
God participates, and God cares, and God supervises.
Yeah.
But that isn't. I mean, God uses in Jewish philosophy, I think, these angels or whatever. But there is no place that I know of it. What?
In the word closer to messenger.
Well, the word malach is the Hebrew word can mean either a messenger or an angel. Yeah.
But
it's some sort of spiritual force that the Almighty employs to
right, that He employs, but that they are not God.
Of course not.
Divine, whereas other faiths do.
We don't give
ascribe divinity to these things. Certainly pagans.
Yeah.
There are a lot of them.
we don't give divine status to anything aside from God.
Right.
No person, no entity, no spirit, no nothing.
Which is certainly one of the reasons for Jesus not being
Correct. That's absolutely correct. And even some people misunderstand the idea of a soul as being some sort of part of God. It's not. The idea of having a part of God, that's antithetical to basic Jewish faith. It could be a spiritual entity, and God's also a spiritual entity, but doesn't make it God. Right? Just because an angel is a spiritual entity and your soul is a spiritual entity doesn't mean your soul's an angel. Okay, so we're going to stop here, and we're going to have now a 3-minute break or 5-minute break. Alex Pfeffer in the back brought us some food to the kitchen. Everyone, please.